of lots rewarded. What was the driver for that?
Thank you. That's a couple of reasons. One is because I don't know that there was anyone saying they wanted taller buildings. But when you have bigger lots, you can now have bigger setbacks, not only on the sides, but from Gulf Boulevard. So I think that was one of the drivers.
To help achieve the 116.
To allow whatever that height would be, knowing that that height would have to be, for hotels, two things. Once you have a bigger lot,
Sure.
you have a little less impact. And so that was really a big driver to that. And there would be a lot less of them. Because the reality is when you look at opportunities, even today if we were to look at how many opportunities how many 3-acre or more parcels are there where this could even possibly happen, it's limited. So it's again trying to achieve a goal but not overdevelop. There's always always feel like there's been this balance because there's been one requirement: all of us have had to be residents. We all live here. There were no hoteliers sitting up here. It's us as residents who all have to live here. So I have some of the same issues, concerns, and goals as all of you do and everybody in the audience does. You know, I have no ties to this economically. You know, I've got a family history. I plan on living here forever, and I'm as concerned about traffic, the environment, anything and everything there is to this quality of life.
Good point.
Okay.
Well, and I think, too, when we look back at 1989, like Commissioner Marone said, you know, houses were $150,000, waterfront homes were $150,000, commercial was like, you know, give it away. Give it away. There was no value in our commercial whatsoever. And, you know, all of our homes that were 2-bedroom, 1-baths have now redeveloped to be 4 bedrooms, 4 baths. And, you know, cars on the road, when it was a winter residence for most of our residents now, we're talking full-time residents, so we have more cars on the road for that. We've got more day trippers that are moving in geographically into the Tampa Bay area. So at what point is what's going on in the road contribute to the hotels? And, you know, and I think keeping that in perspective while we're trying to figure out what problems are we going to solve, does that solve that? You know, does that prevent this? Does it solve that? And how does that play into it? Because right now, because the state coastal control line, they're over density anyway. They're non-conforming. So I think that, you know, I love this presentation. I think I love your one-on-one class. You can tell that you're adjunct professor here. It's coming out today. And it was absolutely amazing. And Brandon, your research, I had no idea you were going to this in-depth. It's really pretty great. So thank you, staff, for doing what you're doing. And let's move on. Sorry for talking.
Yeah, it seems that you look at pre-2015 from 2002 to 2015, we had 9 different comprehensive plan revisions of some sort or another because of potential economic drivers. And in the 7-8 years since then, we haven't had any. But economics have changed. We had recession, we bounced back, potentially on the verge of another recession, who knows. And so that's part of the reason why we're sitting here having this conversation and saying, hey, is it time for us to take a look at it again? Because things have changed. Lot values are not the same. Our economic makeup is not the same. Our residents' makeup is not the same. Our traffic isn't the same. A lot of things have changed. And so I do appreciate the history lesson here, and it's very comprehensive. It's very good. But I think that's one of the reasons that we're here, is because we have not looked at these things in quite some time.
Some of the other items that were brought up in the 2003 master plan that are currently addressed in our regulations, poor multimodal connectivity. Of course, there's a requirement for the wider public sidewalk during development that's along Gulf Boulevard, Blind Pass Road, and throughout the downtown districts. I believe one of the questions we received, one of the public comments, was the 10-foot sidewalk and how it ties into current sidewalk benefits that is required during development, and most of the recent developments that have been approved have been required to provide that sidewalk. There's a requirement for pedestrian frontage features along the major commercial corridors. There's a requirement for the frontage landscaping, but the city
Randy, can I
also...
just go back to the 10-foot sidewalk? You said it's required because it's in the part of the comp plan, right?
Comprehensive plan and land development.
So what was, do you know what the genesis or the basis for that 10-foot sidewalk is? Like, why it had to be 10 feet? Was it public safety issue? Was it ingress, egress? I know, what was the reason?
I think it's a combination of those. It provides more room for passing on the sidewalk. I don't think the intent was to allow for bikes or anything else like that on the sidewalk. I think it was mostly for pedestrians. Do you agree with that,
I
Alex?
just wonder if it was derived from a state standard or something like that.
Yeah, typically when you have a sidewalk on a very heavily used commercial corridor like Gulf Boulevard is, you are going to have traffic going in both north-south directions on the boulevard. And if you got two people going in one direction, you run into two people going in the other direction. You don't want anybody to have to step into the road. So it is considered a safer environment for pedestrians when you have that kind of space. It could be people on strollers, people with wheelchairs, and everything else that provides that two-way, connectivity where people feel very comfortable and safe. So that's industry-wide is what it is considered a good design element for a highly used commercial corridor like Gulf Boulevard is.
Thanks for answering that question. I know it was, at least it was part of an inquiry that was included in the public comments.
Right.
And we've had discussion on 10-foot sidewalks in other parts of the city several times.
So there's a requirement for both the frontage landscaping, but also pedestrian frontage features. For example, Quarry Landings will be providing bike racks and trash cans and other features that accompany the sidewalk expansion and the landscaping. A requirement for beach access points and an airport circulator specifically for the large resort developments. The beach access points are required among more than just the largest developments, but the circulator is required for the largest of projects. A transportation management plan strategy or strategies are required for all projects based on the scale of the development. And there is internal circulation requirements within the site itself for certain mixed uses in the activity center district.
Brandon, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I read through the statutes on the traffic management plan and the requirement for an airport shuttle. You've used the word circulator, which sounds more attractive than what I read, which was just a very non-specific requirement for a quote-unquote shuttle, but no specifics on it. I mean, I felt like the way it was written, a resort could get away with running one van trip back and forth to the airport per day, and that would satisfy the letter of the law. So they may not have an interest in providing a true circulating shuttle. Is that allowed, or?
Well, I think there's two requirements, especially for the large development projects that need to provide the shuttle. There is the shuttle requirement, which could be addressed through a conditional use permit. Those would all need to go for public hearing, but the transportation management plan is an additional requirement, and the benefits that are provided are relative to the scale of the project. So something like freebie expansion or some other kind of local circulator might be more appropriate for a transportation management plan, even if the airport shuttle is still required by the comprehensive plan. It's actually called out specifically as a shuttle.
Okay.
Just for terminology, sorry. So internal circulation is within the property? I mean, airport shuttle is pretty well defined. I mean, we got that part.
Yes, internal circulation is within the property, which basically keeps vehicles out of the boulevard.
Okay.
And who makes sure that all
Through
these properties
the-
have,
Sorry?
and who makes sure that these properties have these airport circulators?
So through the transportation management plan that they have to submit, conditional use approvals are ongoing requirements. So they will have two types of requirements for, in the approval that is going to come in front of the commission. There are requirements that are one-time requirements, it's basically infrastructure type things, where you are going to have to build this and build that and build that, and all those are part of the one-time approvals. There are also, you can build in ongoing conditions for them to maintain the approval going. So with those, basically, if you say you got to, contribute to Freebie, you got to maintain the shuttle, whatever conditions get put in, become an ongoing requirement, and the city has the right to audit that is maintained, and there is a process by which you can pull that conditional use approval if there is not being maintained. So really the hammer is on the city commission side, that if somebody is not doing the things, it can be reversed. I mean, we had a situation just recently with the new owners of the Hotel Zamora, where they were not complying with the conditional use of the roof terrace that had been approved with the music. And I basically sent them a letter saying that I was going to be bringing their conditional use back to the city commission to revisit if they didn't come into compliance. Within 48 hours, I had the new owners flying into the city. It's like, no, we're going to do it. So there are mechanisms for things to come back to the commission and enforce whatever conditions you put in.
So these 2015, this is for only for any conditional use that was filed after 2015?
These are for conditional uses created after 2015, yes, right.
Okay. So if,
Yeah.
3 acres.
Yeah.
Large resort, there's only 2. You have to be over 3 acres, and that's the Serrata and Tradewinds. So there is no other property over 3 acres currently.
So to net it out, in the CUP application, the developer would present their transportation plan back, just to make sure we close Member Hubbard's question. They would have to, the developer would come in with their proposal, and then the commission can decide it's adequate or inadequate as part of that CUP, and particularly to the airport shuttle. So we have the ability to say once a day doesn't cut it, guys. It needs to be X times a day, and we'll have that debate some other time.
Correct.
So
And then if
that
they
requirement can be made even though the statute doesn't state that specifically? Okay,
Correct.
okay.
Okay. And then if they're not doing X times a day, we have an audit right, and if we find it's something less than X, we have the ability to first help to work in short compliance, then B, and it's worst, pull that CUP and end
Correct. And
that.
it will be entitled, there will be a hearing back with the city commission saying they're out of compliance, and the discussion will be, what's the penalty?
And that's on any CUP.
That's on any CUP. Yeah.
The airport shuttle is just specific here. Okay.
Correct.
Peace.
Yeah.
Thank
So-
you.
that's any condition of the CUP.
Any of the conditions of the CUP. So, out of memory, Corey Landings, I believe, had 14 or 15 conditions on their CUP.
We did.
Some of them fell into the category of one time, and some are ongoing requirements that they will have.
Yeah, we had, if I remember correctly, a medium-sized debate over rooftop music.
Correct. Right.
Addressing unattractive building design and site layout, the city now has substantial design requirements, especially in downtown, but throughout the community redevelopment district for breaks in massing, elimination of blank planes. Building planes can't just continue on for hundreds of feet. There need to be offsets. There need to be features reflected in any kind of new development. Required integration of interesting design features and promotion of front pedestrian courtyards with parking hidden, especially in downtown. Parking needs to be generally toward the rear of the structure. The step back requirements that we had addressed before regarding new development over 50 feet. In the large resort district, for example, despite the height limit being 116 feet, and the front setback being 25 feet, the 116-foot portion of the building cannot be at 25 feet setback from Gulf Boulevard. It needs to step back as the building gets taller. There's a requirement for masking parking structures through integration with the building in the downtown, and enhanced landscaping and pedestrian frontage features. And finally, addressing quality construction, of course, coming up to compliance with the building codes and FEMA in large part has to do with new development. Building codes can be addressed retroactively in existing structures, but it's largely a result of redevelopment incentives. There is a requirement in the code currently for compliance with green building standards in new development. All new development needs to integrate at least 2 green building standards. It could be LEED, it could be others of that caliber. Incentives for high-quality materials, colors, and building facades. Those can be addressed both through the conditional use permit criteria and through the residential and temporary lodging density pool criteria. As you may remember, the density pools used to be a first-come, first-served. They're now on a case-by-case basis. The City Commission has more control over the various criteria that are looked at in those new developments. There were a number of master plan issues that were not adopted in the current comprehensive plan. Just to go through 4 of them, minimum condominium room size was recommended. That was never included. Grandfathering of non-conforming densities during elective development. That has not been put into our active policies. Development of a community redevelopment agency. The city was never approved for a community redevelopment district, so that has never been put in place. And then large redevelopment projects requiring complete site demolition and rebuild, that had been brought up, but that is not currently integrated into our code or comprehensive plan. We wanted to talk a little bit about forthcoming development impacts, starting off with what is a conditional use permit and what is it not. Conditional uses are uses that may or may not have significant adverse impacts on the surrounding area, public or natural resources, or may create nuisances without or despite mitigating conditions. The Land Development Code requires that all conditional use permits be heard by the City Commission at a public hearing. Certain large temporary lodging projects requirements also require planning board review. The Miramar Emerald Sands redevelopment went to planning board prior to City Commission review. Conditional use permit requests can ultimately be approved with conditions, or denied. So starting out, the initial burden for approval of a conditional use permit is on the applicant. It's not on the city, it's on the applicant to demonstrate that the standards and conditions that are in our code have been met. Once the applicant claims that such a demonstration has been made, the City Commission reviews the application to the relevant standards of the Comprehensive Plan and the Land Development Code. There are many, many standards that are looked at for conditional use permits, including there are additional standards for conditional use permits in the Community Redevelopment District that don't apply elsewhere in the city. But to give an example of some of the standards, there's consistency with the comprehensive plan goals, objectives, and policies, compatibility with adjacent development, whether there are going to be any adverse impacts from dust, fumes, noise, operations, light glare, any other kind of nuisances like those. Stormwater management, traffic circulation, again, within the site, but also the impact on the transportation system outside of the site. What a conditional use permit is not a variance from the Land Development Code. A variance is a relief from a development requirement of the Land Development Code other than use. St. Pete Beach does not permit use variances or waivers, and I believe that's also a state restriction as well. We do not allow any kind of variances for uses. A conditional use is a use that is subject to stricter scrutiny than a permitted use. And just to give a few examples, a permitted use would be something like a single-family residence in a single-family zoning district. It's a use that's permitted. It would still go through the site plan, the building permit process, but there's no elevated review for a permitted use. A conditional use would be something like a large hotel project in a temporary lodging zoning district. Any use over 30 units an acre or 50 feet in height in the large resort district needs to be reviewed by both the planning board and the city commission. A variance would be a dimensional reduction, such as a reduction to a required setback, and anything that is not permitted and not conditional in a zoning district is prohibited. No one could obtain a variance to put a gas station in a single-family zoning district. There's just no avenue to do that. It needs to be a permitted or a conditional use to be applied for. So without going through the whole table, we wanted to discuss a little bit with how the development rights have changed over time, specifically within the beach resort districts. So prior to 2003 was the C2 Tourist Residential District, with, again, a 30-unit density to the mean high water line. In 2003, the resort facilities medium zoning took effect. Again, the same standard, 30 resort units per acre to the mean high water line. In the 2008 amendments, which are currently in place as amended in 2015, there was a division made between the large resort district that's north of the county parking lot and the boutique hotel condo district that's south of the county parking lot. In large resort, the permitted density is now 30 units per acre to the coastal construction control line. I'll give an example of that in a few slides. That can exceed 30 to 50 units per acre with a conditional use permit if the site is under 3 acres in size, or up to 75 units per acre with a conditional use permit if over 3 acres. In the boutique hotel condo district, this is the process that the Miramar redevelopment went through a few years back. They are also permitted 30 units per acre to the control line. Someone wanted to develop a hotel with 30 units per acre, they would be able to proceed just to site plan, no need for a conditional use permit hearing. But to go to, they have the option to go to 50 units with a conditional use permit and 70 units withdrawing from the conditional use permit subject to density pool availability.
Just a...
Yes.
So the way that it reads for large resort and boutique, if they're looking for 30 units or less per acre, it's just a straightforward permitting process.
Correct.
Correct.
And anything beyond that requires a CUP.
Correct.
Okay.
And that also applies to height in both districts. Any hotel larger than 50 or taller than 50 feet in height requires a conditional use permit.
So I know this is going to come up a little bit later in the presentation, but maybe city attorney, is the 30 units per acre, would that be considered part of the vested property rights? And anything above that?
If it's vested in, it's represented in the land development regulations, right? The density, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so then it would be vested, yeah. I mean, so theoretically, your comprehensive plan establishes your ceiling. And if you have, let's say, I'm going to say hypothetically, 100 units to the acre in your future land use map, but that's a 20-year time frame, and the underlying zoning is 50. You're not entitled to the 100. You know, you can't just look at the comp plan and say that's an entitlement, but your land development regulations are, you are vested. You can say that those are vested property rights. So I'm pretty sure that the comp plan pretty much mirrors, right? Like the densities and intensities are mirrored almost exactly in your future land use element with your zoning, 1-to-1.
Thank you.
This was brought up earlier in the meeting, but I wanted to review 2 ordinances that address how density calculations have changed since 2003 and prior to that as well, but the language was associated with the readoption of the Land Development Code, so it was provided in 2003. The calculation of density at the time only excluded land devoted to public rights-of-way. So any land on a property that was taken for the purpose of expanding a street would not be counted toward density, but otherwise submerged land and land seaward of the coastal construction control line was counted toward permitted density for the property. In 2008-33, Ordinance 2008-33, in order to come into compliance with the county regulations, the city adopted an updated definition that now excluded any land devoted to public rights-of-way, which again was in place prior, but also any submerged land and land seaward of the state of Florida coastal construction control line. And here's an example of how that change took effect. This is the Alden Suites in the large resort district. The site itself, measuring to the mean high water line, is approximately 5.85 acres. And prior to 2008, the allowable density was that land between the control line and the mean high water line, which is about 2.25 acre, plus the area landward that was private property, which was 3.6 acres. And that would have allowed it a 30 unit per acre density, about 175 units. After 2008, the permitted density, again, the density that would allow a project to proceed to permitting without any kind of public review, is 108. And the reason for that was due to the reduction, the elimination of that land between the control line and the mean high water line from that permitted density. So that was a drop of about 67 units due to that change in definition. And this is just an example. It happened to other properties up and down the large resort district, but it's just the one that we had available. Now, after 2008, through the new conditional use permit regulations, the site would allow for up to 270 units, but again, anything above 108 estimated would be a conditional use permit for that 75 units per acre. They meet the 3 acre threshold, but anything above 30 per acre would require a conditional use permit hearing.
And Brandon, excuse me, and that is density that survived the legal challenges and negotiated settlement. That density survived all of that. Okay.
The one on the right.
One on the right, the
One on the
One
right.
on the
The
far
density,
right.
yeah, the 75, right?
I wanted to talk a little bit about density pools. We're one of the few communities in Pinellas County that utilize density pools. And what they are is a finite quantity of temporary lodging or residential units allocated for specific districts through the comprehensive plan that may allow a property to be developed with additional units than would otherwise be permitted or conditionally permitted under the property's district regulations. In 2020, the city amended the density pool allocation criteria from a first-come, first-served to a case-by-case basis, implementing elevated review criteria specifically for the residential density pools. The city has numerous density pools. They all have slightly different regulations, but they were created from drawing density out of another district and moving it to another district. The units were not just created. The district wasn't allowed to go over its conditional density at the time. They were caused from moving them out of one district, specifically the large resort, to other districts in the city. So the residential density pool, this should be fresh. It was requested by the Quarry Landings project. That was 195 units. It's now down to 45 units. And that pool was created entirely by reducing the large resort district residential density from 18 down to 15. There's about 65 acres in the large resort district. 65 times 3 created just about the 195 units that are available to any other district in the community redevelopment district. The Activity Center, Town Center 2, and Bayou Residential Lodging Density Pool, this is what allowed the Hotel Zamora to be developed. That's 325 units. Zamora has drawn 64 out, I believe. And again, that was caused by reducing the large resort district lodging density from 85 to 75. That was done during the 2005 to 2008 amendments. There are also density pools in the town center core. There's a limited number of units that are allowed for bed and breakfast development. The Boutique Hotel condo, that's again south of the county parking lot. The Miramar in its Emerald Sands redevelopment drew a number of units from this pool. And the Upham Beach Village district, there are 175 lodging units that allow for redevelopment of lodging uses in that area.
Yeah, and the Upham Beach Village has is a little quirky in its construction because while it has 175 units, no property can develop more than the number of units currently existing on the property. And there are total, I believe, is 90 or 95 hotel rooms in that district. So the most they can do is another 95. So that 175 is really, while in paper exists, there's no realistic way to anybody to get to the 175. The most they can, if everybody builds to their maximum capacity, it'll be 95 units.
So Brandon, I mean, on the density pools, if we could step back for a minute, and do we have a total number of bodies that are allowed on the island at any one time? So for evacuation purposes, are we limited to residential, transient, add it all together? How many, is there a limit to how many people can be on the island at any given time? And the second question on the density pools, on the bottom of the chart, I mean, you explained where they came from and a little bit of the why, but why? Why did we take and create these pools? What was the, I know it's a bit of a historical question, what was the genesis of that? Why, I mean, it makes sense, I mean, we've been through it and I understand it, but why? And I think it will help to, just for people to understand, so thanks.
Yeah, so on the first question, on the road capacity question, it really boils down to the fact that if you have a hurricane, you have a tropical storm, the first people that are not going to be here are your day trippers. The day trippers are the people who come to the beach, and the reason why Saturday is the peak day for traffic in St. Pete Beach, which is completely abnormal to like most other cities where the peak traffic is, Monday to Friday, AM peak and PM peak. Our peak is in Saturday afternoons. So those people are not going to be around if there's a tropical storm or hurricane coming in. The second group that will immediately disappear is the transient people, because cancellations will begin to occur when you've been a watch has been issued, then and all those hotels are going to begin evaluating. And then they will have to evacuate, right? So they're beginning to move. So when you get to the actual storm, the people that you really are focusing on trying to evacuate and make sure you have enough roads to get them out are your residents, because they're going to be the last ones to leave and the ones that are going to be fighting with each other in terms of traffic at the last minute. So each road has a capacity level, and FDOT provides the capacity levels for all of the state roads. Well, I don't know the rationale as to they were trying to create these pools. I see the logic in creating them, because it does give the commission a lot more discretion as to where you put development, as opposed to have development scattered throughout the community. By putting it into a pool and letting the commission decide where that happens, you got a lot more control in terms of what kind of development do you want, and where you want to concentrate those units.
So I understand the evacuation piece, but and I know we have gone through that recently in that, I'll call that staged exit, but does, and in other parts of the state, does the state come in and say, look, you can only have X number of people in this town, or is it not that thought through?
There is a plan that has to get submitted to the state, and it's actually the county is the one who runs it. When new development is going to be happening of any large significance, they will look into that.
I can maybe help answer that question. So you're talking about people, but from a comprehensive plan standpoint, it's more about density. and number of units. And so going back to the original comprehensive plan that was required in 1985, and our first one was 1989, that had a certain amount of density. And as the city looked at changing that, as we kind of understood changes over time, and trying to promote tourism, there was movement of density. And so it became clear that there would be some density that would never be utilized, like you mentioned Upland Beach, and maybe that's still the case there. But there was some movement of density to allow for hotel development. And I think there was a recognition to go from the 18 to the 15 on the residential side, because we didn't want to promote condominiums, really wanted to promote hotels, but the state always looked at never increasing that amount. That was originally established in 1989, and that was one thing. The state rules have changed, and Andrew kind of explained, they were a lot more hands-on back at that time, maybe a little bit less now.
So it's a great question, and if you look at the statute, which is 163-3177, that contents of your comprehensive plan, it does talk about, that idea of density and intensity, and specifically coastal communities and hurricane evacuation. In fact, the lawsuit that was settled that ultimately ended up in the 2015 plan, one of the things that the Department of Community Affairs at that time, they actually issued a what's called an ORC report, or objections, recommendations, and comments. And it's where you basically when you submitted your plan or your plan amendments to the state, they actually had planners up there that looked at this stuff, and they asked questions, and they looked at the data, and they studied it. It was the Department of Community Affairs. Now all of that has been shifted into the Department of Economic Development, and it's geared towards economic development. But in your 2015 plan, I believe that there was actually an objection from the state on the plan that was submitted, that had a comment in relation to there wasn't enough analysis. I'm going off of it. It's actually in there, but an analysis on evacuation. And there's also like that analysis of investment of capital funds in coastal high hazard areas. So that's why that coastal community, coastal management section of the Growth Management Act, or whatever, the Community Planning Act, is so important. But that was actually an issue back then. They studied it and they said, yeah, you guys, you haven't demonstrated that you can get everybody off the island in a safe and orderly manner. It was a comment, I believe, from the Department of Community Affairs back when, as Commissioner Furlowski said, they actually had a planning department up there, and they had planners that studied this, and they knew they can compare apples and apples with, Brevard County and Pinellas County. They saw plans from all over the state. So it was a really fantastic brain trust of planners who were in Tallahassee kind of reviewing these things, but then it was deemed to be, as time evolved, that, as Commissioner Marone mentioned, economic development became an issue because of the downturn of the economy. So now the emphasis is on, I don't think that they have issued comments on non-compliance. They've processed thousands of amendments per year, and I don't think probably a handful of cases where the state has stepped in and said no. Very infrequently. So basically, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
You have a lot of home rule. You have a lot of home rule authority. Let's just put it that way when it comes to planning.
Okay, thank you.
The basis for those density pools, it does vary for pool by pool. The residential density pool, actually as amended in 2020, was to have those catalytic projects that are impactful. The activity center, town center 2, and bioresidential, those are to allow potentially temporary lodging projects in those districts at all. Unlike the beachfront resort districts, those are not a permitted use except by density pool availability. If a project were to come in, take all 325 lodging units, there could not be another temporary lodging project in any of those districts. It's subject entirely to pool availability. And as Alex had mentioned, with the Up and Beach Village, it's to allow existing lodging uses to redevelop up to a certain limit.
Thank you.
So there are multiple ways, of course, to look at projected development. One that staff completed in the last few years was an estimate of equivalent residential units, and an ERU is the impact of a certain type and/or size of development expressed fractionally in relation to a single-family home being 1 ERU in terms of sewer demand. This is specifically sewer demand. It's not a composite. It doesn't address population, at least not directly, or transportation impacts. It's specifically for sewer demand. And you can see some of the major ERU equivalents on the screen. A single-family residence, again, is 1. A hotel room would be 0.7 ERU. Restaurant is 2 per 1,000 square feet. General commercial, 0.3 per 1,000. And office, 0.2 per 1,000. So you can see, based on the 2021 staff estimates that were put together, that the vast bulk, of course, of the residential ERUs in the city are outside of the community redevelopment district. About 78% are outside the redevelopment district, 21% are within it. For transient ERUs and commercial ERUs, the numbers are basically flipped. The community redevelopment district has the vast bulk of the transient ERUs in the city, and about 4 out of 5 of the commercial ERUs. Currently, our estimate of the ERU count citywide is 10,647, and again, that's 10,647 single-family home equivalents of impact on the sewer system. So looking back at the development that's been completed since 2013, the city has seen minimal new development come online, with most impacts resulting from conversion of existing spaces. An average of 7 ERUs have come online each year since 2013. The largest project has been the Hotel Zamora. Actually, both times that they've come forward for city commission approval, there was the original hotel development, which included the 50 lodging units and the 3,700 square feet of restaurant. They returned in 2020 to seek to convert 14 suites to 28 rooms. That was another draw from the density pool, and that was about a 10 ERU impact. Some of the other projects have been the Sherwin-Williams store from 2013, the Masteries Brewing Company development back in 2015, and then a conversion of the Slice Pizza location and the Hilton Garden Inn. Hilton Garden Inn followed a similar development to Hotel Zamora. They didn't add a floor, they didn't add new space onto the development, but they did convert suites to rooms. Looking at committed forthcoming development, again, these are projects that have been approved. Corey Landings, of course, accounts for the vast bulk of the committed ERUs. The 243 residential units, they also have a number of ERUs for the restaurant, commercial, and office space that is being developed. The Emerald Sands was another project with 16.8 lodging units. They had an existing density, so we just took the difference for this calculation, and then the new restaurant space that they are proposing. The Don Cesar Conference Room has about a 4 ERU impact, as we estimated, and there was an office to restaurant conversion along Gulf Boulevard. That's about a 4 ERU impact as well.
When was that one?
It's not open yet.
But when was the conversion and the approval done?
That was earlier this year, last year and earlier this year.
Okay, thank you.
Brandon, if I may, just to correct myself a little bit, so the plan that the DCA, Department of Community Affairs, actually issued a notice of intent to find the plan not in compliance, I believe was your original, the 1999 plan, so it wasn't the 2015, it was back in 1999, and that had something to do with the ability to protect property and things like that from hurricanes and so forth. So I wanted to make sure that was correct for the record.
And that restaurant conversion was in a commercial district that allows restaurant by right as a permitted use. So as I mentioned, back in 2021, staff estimated community redevelopment district-wide ERU estimates based on maximum possible and expected redevelopment scenarios. The expected scenario assumed properties were redeveloped to their maximum density and intensity allowed by code under the following parameters. There would be no redevelopment of condominiums. Properties that currently exceed the density or intensity allowed under the code would not be redeveloped. Properties that had recently undergone multi-million-dollar renovations would not be redeveloped, and there would be limited property consolidation. Again, speaking back to the benefits that or the incentives that the city provides for property consolidation, it would vary district by district. So an expected build-out, and again, this can be looked at as a maximum realistic build-out. Staff would estimate an increase of approximately 3,500 ERUs to 1,400 ERUs citywide, or about a 34% increase from where the city was at the time of the estimates being put together. They did not include the Quarry Landings projects or the other committed projects that have since been approved. In terms of the growth potential, the greatest potential growth would be in the commercial side at 1,659 ERUs. Transient would allow up to 1,112 ERUs, and residential would be up to 773 ERUs, but again, that is inclusive of the Quarry Landings 243. In terms of where we anticipate the most significant growth to be possible, that would be the town center core at 1,071 ERUs, the large resort following at 900 ERUs, and activity center at 507 ERUs. And I'll talk about those in a moment.
Just,
Yes.
I'm not sure if this goes to your previous question, Commissioner Grill, but based on this and the staff report, so from where we are at today, if we built out everything, it's another 34% increase over our current, where we are?
In terms of sewer demand based on the estimates, yes.
But I mean, that's more than just sewer demand, because obviously that impacts everything else, beaches, streets.
Here's the important part of this. Of that number, about half of that is commercial space, right? So commercial space is not necessarily impacting the number of people that go to the beach, right? Because the commercial space is going to be utilized by the transient people and the residential people. So is a complementary use to the other two.
But we're dealing with ERUs, which is the equivalent of one single-family house, 3 toilets, a kitchen, 2 cars.
Correct. So for sewer is correct. But you cannot necessarily interpolate that for other components, right? So when you say beaches, the commercial side is not going to affect the beach. It's going to affect transportation, it's going to affect sewer, it's going to affect water, but doesn't affect everything in the entire environment. It affects some components of that.
Sure, but my ERU doesn't affect the beach either so much. So
unless you go to the beach, right?
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, this is where we see that the comp plan over the next 20 years, okay, can be the maximum that it can take you to. This assumes that every property develops to their maximum potential development site. And that is one of the tools that we use, because we have to plan for that. So when we're looking at infrastructure requirements, we have to plan for that everybody is going to follow, the maximum development potential that they have under the comp plan. And that is going back to what Andrew said at the beginning. That is really one of the key components as to why you have a comp plan. Because the comp plan basically says, these are your growth areas, these are your growth potential. Then we run, we are able to, based on those numbers, run this analysis and be able to come back and say, okay, for the next 20 years, this is what we're going to need to put in place to address all of that. And if everything works perfectly, then that's how the magic really happens, that you have the right infrastructure to meet the needs of your comp plan.
Does this maximum density calculation consider a scenario where conditional use permit is granted for the full value of?
Yeah, it means that anybody who's eligible for a conditional use gets granted. It means that every pool is used to the max, right? So it assumes all of that.
Because I'm thinking, if a conditional use permit were not granted under the current comp plan, how would that affect the percentage increase in, say, the hotel district, large hotel district?
Yeah, everything drops from this number. So for example, if there's a hotel that comes in and applies for 90% of what their maximum is, then what we do is you go back to the chart built before, and then instead of putting and assume 100% potential, we say, okay, it's going to be developed at this level, and it will go from the category of potential to the category of real at a lower number. Right.
And the conditional use permit is some control mechanism on density.
It's tremendous leverage. I mean, it just gives, the commission like a tremendous amount of leverage to get a quality product at the end. But what I'm curious about...
I'm not talking about quality product as much as I'm talking about density.
Well...
Because I think that's that's kind of the focus, is density. So I just wanted to confirm my evaluation of the presentation in that this commission could deny conditional use permits that would result in, for example, the large hotel district, their percentage increase being significantly reduced from the numbers we're seeing here.
Right. Now, whether you can deny or not the conditional use, Andrew's going to get into that later on.
Okay.
But the sewer system, for example, that we plan, is planned to handle that. It's planned to handle 35% increase over the next 20 years, and that is our working model for the sewer system, is to be able to address that component.
So that's, you planned it to, some would say best case, some would say worst case scenario, to handle the max capacity, assuming 100% of everything approved, we can handle it, or something less, and that capacity, because you can't change your sewer capacity very easily.
Well, and it is, when you're doing the project, it is a lot easier to make it a little bit bigger than make it too small and then having to go back and retrofit it. Yeah, so 100% right.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I hadn't finished my thought. What I was going with that was our impact on the ERUs, or the density impact on the city. At what point do we take into those other elements that are new, that weren't around 20 years ago or 10 years ago, whether it's Uber, whether it's getting rid of our trolley system, or Central Avenue trolley, that cut down on those visits, and setting up our multimodal, our microtransit. At what point do we start taking all of those elements into the impact to the increased density?
So as we work through each of the different infrastructure pieces, there are considerations as to the changing environments. So if we're staying with sewer systems, for example, we know now that low-flow toilets are a requirement. So there are going to be efficiencies built into the forecast that says, when you go into ERUs and saying 35% increase in ERUs, you're also taking into account that the number of gallons per home, per ERU, are going to be dropping because of a more efficient toilet systems. So when you're looking at the transportation component, you're going to be looking into the future in terms of changing trends, in terms of automobile ownership and ride sharing and all of those components that are looking into the future. All of that goes into planning the needs for each of the different service types.
And these numbers also reflect, well, of course, sanitary sewer, but also solid waste, drainage, potable water.
This specific analysis is for sanitary sewer, right. Because remember that water, garbage, the garbage, you're not really worrying about collection, you're worrying about the disposal of the garbage. So is really more of a county responsibility. The water is a county responsibility. They run similar models and they work with our data to look at their needs of what they're going to be providing, right?
Yeah, I'd just like to kind of make an observation, because I don't want anybody to look at the data in the wrong way. This is a good planning exercise for sanitary sewer, but it shouldn't be looked at as the city's going to increase by 34%. This is kind of the master plan, of which most master plans never are realized. I remember thinking back that, in New York City, when they allowed the Empire State Building to build to 100 stories, I'm sure there were people saying, wow, can you imagine if Manhattan was all 100-story buildings everywhere? 100 years later, that has not happened. Why? Because when you look at the commercial number alone, the biggest number, I would argue that 1,659 ERUs, there's not an economy to support that. So it's probably not going to happen. No one did the economic analysis on this to take a look at this. This was simply an exercise to make sure that when we were building our sanitary sewer system, there wouldn't be an oops, we didn't factor that in.
Yeah,
So-
and you err on this side, which is the
Yeah.
point that Commissioner Grill was making before. You had to err here because.
So, I just wanted to say that I didn't want anybody to look at this and say the city's going to grow by 34%, and that means everything.
Good point.
So looking at the areas of the city, the three districts where the potentially most impactful redevelopment could occur, first and foremost would be the Town Center Core District in and around Corey Avenue. There's substantial potential for additional commercial floor area mixed with upper story residential that provides this district the greatest potential for density and intensity increases in the city. And the reason for that is so many of the districts, as we talked about before, require property consolidation just outright to have certain uses or have certain intensities or densities. That's not required in the Town Center Core. Again, it could be a practicality limitation of having a certain kind of development on a 5,000 or 10,000 square foot lot, but its potential, it is an allowed use in this district in the way that it's not in others. In the large resort district, that would be the second potentially most impactful. There are a few independent condominiums that break up the resort properties of 3 contiguous acres, which would allow for that maximum request for density of 75 units per acre. And there's also provision for accessory commercial for these developments. And third would be the activities center. There are incentives for property consolidation and mixed-use bonuses, particularly in and around Dolphin Village, where some of the acreage thresholds that the comp plan and land development code set have already been met. Looking at the areas that may be less impactful, the downtown core residential, just south of here, the district is already near its maximum residential build-out in the comprehensive plan. The City Commission does have the ability to increase its density slightly, but it's a smaller district. It's just under 12 acres, so we would expect no more than about 20 ERUs at maximum build-out. Up in Beach Village, many of the residential properties, even with the incentives that the city has in place, would not benefit from redevelopment, even if they were to consolidate and follow the bonuses that the city had in place. So any kind of significant ERU increase in that district, we would expect to be from the limited temporary lodging density pool. Town Center Coquina West, the master plan had recommended a very high density that is not in our code currently. In order to redevelop this district as a large mixed-use project, it effectively requires consolidation of an entire block. There are many properties on each block, so that would be a task, and to draw those additional ERUs would be a significant ask. And finally would be the Blind Pass Road Commercial Corridor District. It is one of the smaller districts within the Community Redevelopment District. There is already commercial development along the strip, so we do not expect a significant impact from that zoning district. We wanted to provide some just demographic information, population data, and some of the demographic and economic changes that have occurred in recent times. So looking at our population, this is directly from the comprehensive plan for the 1980 and 90 numbers, and from the census for 2000 onward. We saw the city grow from about 9,300 people in 1980 just under 10,000 in 2000. The permanent population has dropped since then. It went down to 9,346 in 2010 and to just under 9,000 in 2020. Now, taking that ERU analysis that we just referenced and extending it again at maximum build-out based on what we would expect to see in the Community Redevelopment District, that would put the citywide build-out at our census numbers of about 2 persons per household at around 10,400 people. That would put us about 500 people over the 2,000 peak. And looking at the comprehensive plans, when the comments on population in the 1989 and 1998 plans, it's not too far out of range. The 1989 plan quoted, when added to the UF estimates of 9,976 persons, the city could conceivably support a population of about 10,465. That was the carrying capacity estimated back in 1989. And the 1998 plan projected a residential population of about 10,000 persons in the next 10 years. Obviously, that did not materialize. The density, the number of people rather dropped after the 1998 comprehensive plan. But that 10,000 number, in the range of 10,000, has been around for quite some time.
And the numbers that you see here is not that we have less single-family homes, is a change for more seasonal residents than permanent residents, because the census is dealing with, the permanent residents of the city. And you see in the next graph how our neighboring cities are basically kind of going in the same direction.
And so again, as our population has dropped about 10% since 2000, our permanent population, Treasure Islands has dropped about the same, South Pasadena in the same range as well. Unfortunately, we do not have statistics for Tierra Verde, but this is what we had available. So moving on to some of the demographic economic changes focused on the last 10 years. One of the items that's called for in our comprehensive plan is commercial taking on a greater burden of the taxes, and we have not seen a significant change in the assessed value of properties over the last 10 years. It started around 20% for commercial, around 80% for residential. Those numbers have been about the same over the last 10 years. Again, we haven't seen a significant amount of development over the last 10 years that would cause those numbers to change significantly. We did, between 2018 and 2021, see a slight uptick in commercial, a slight downtick in residential, but they have meandered back toward their original numbers.
So based on this, it looks like our residential properties represent roughly 80% of our taxes.
Of the assessed value, correct.
About 76 of the last year, 76.9 the last year, yeah, very close.
Looking at some of the demographic changes, St. Pete Beach average age has gone from about 57 years in 2013 up to about 60 years in 2021, 61. Pinellas County has an average age of 48.5 compared to Florida, which is 42.3. Per capita personal income has risen in the city. That's looking at the real inflation-adjusted numbers as well as the nominal numbers. Looking at inflation-adjusted per capita personal income in St. Pete Beach in 2013, it was just over $60,000. Looking at 2022, which is the most recent data year that we have, it was about $75,000. So it has increased significantly. That is significantly higher than both Pinellas County, which in 2021 had a per capita personal income of about $43,000, and it's higher, almost double Florida at $38,000.
If I may, on the previous slide, do we have a breakdown of the ERUs for the city, for citywide residential versus commercial?
Yes. You can go back to that.
We do.
Yeah, we looked at slide,
Right there.
So this is the estimate for build-out. We also have a slide for current, if you would like to see that.
For current one.
Current.
So which one's which?
The bolded number down at the bottom, that is the percentage.
So the first column is residential, then transient, then commercial.
Okay, thank you.
So 72% is residential.
And then looking at our largest employers, the top 4 are resorts, Tradewinds, the Don Cesar, and their Beach House Suites property, the Grand Plaza and Beachcomber Resorts, which are under common ownership, and Serrata Resort, followed by the City of St. Pete Beach, my employer, and then Public Supermarket.
Do we have any numbers of how many of those are employees who live in City of St. Pete Beach?
No. I think this is my last set of slides here. We pulled together some county maps. Every year, the county publishes maps regarding average annual daily traffic. And this is on each road segment. I have maps that I put together that shows the various segments. The bidirectional, so the north-south, in the case of Gulf Boulevard, traffic each day. I don't know that it's collected each day, but there are weekend factors, there are seasonal factors, and it is collected throughout the year between January and December. So looking at Gulf Boulevard from the Bayway up to Gulf Winds Drive, the average annual daily traffic change from 2005 to 2021 has been negative 2%. We saw the highest traffic in 2007 at 26,500 vehicles on average each day. The lowest, of course, unsurprisingly during COVID, at 21,500, with an average right really between those numbers, 23,500. The graph does show that there was a peak right before the recession. The numbers have come down slightly since then. Again, this is average annual daily traffic. It may not take into account shifts and peaks throughout the season if it's offset by a corresponding dip throughout the rest of the year, but that was the data we had available for this workshop. Walking up to Gulf Boulevard between Gulf Winds Drive to 69th Avenue, we've seen a slight increase between 2005 and 2021, 3.7% additional trips on average each day. The highest traffic was in 2017 with 29,500 trips. The lowest, again, during COVID in 2020 with 25,000 trips. And just looking at the other segments, these primarily do not run through the Community Redevelopment District, but we had the data available. You saw a significant peak in 2006 that was never even close to approached again. I know the causeway was under construction between those years, the Treasure Island Causeway. That may have been the reason for that peak. I'm not certain. But we did see a change between 2005 and 2021 of negative 6.7% vehicle trips. Looking from 2009 to 2021, where the numbers calmed down a little bit, there was an increase of about 10%. The same along the 75th Avenue segment. Again, a significant peak right before the recession at 31,000 trips. in 2020, the trips dropped to under 20,000. So the average between 2010 and 2021, where the numbers didn't peak as high as they did prior to the recession, was about 21,000 trips.
So it's interesting, the Gulf Boulevard from Gulf Winds Drive to 69th is up 3.7%. But on the next slide, from 69th to Treasure Island, we're down 6.7%. And on the next slide, from Blind Pass to Sailboat Key, we're down 14%. Where did the cars go? From the 3.7% increase from Gulf Boulevard to 69th. I'm just trying to figure out traffic flows here. Where did they go? Because from there, you go north up to Treasure Island, unless they all got off and they're all going home in District 1 in the north and in North Beach.
It depends on where they put the counters, because they cross.
Yeah.
Right. It could be that there wasn't really traffic going northbound, that it was traffic from Treasure Island coming into St. Pete Beach that was using the 75th Avenue Causeway.
They drove into the bay.
Well, yeah, or they could have been using Gulf Winds or Blind Pass or...
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
And the final segment is the Bayway to Gulf Boulevard, Paso Girl Way at the Don Cesar. There has been an increase of about 7.5% of trips, around 21,000 trips yearly on average. That concludes my presentation. Andrew, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Matthew McConnell, Assistant City Attorney. So we sent this before. Amber sent about 300 pages of statutes and cases yesterday for anyone who's curious. But this presentation is really going to hit on kind of high level. To be frank with you, we could speak about this for 3 hours on its own if you really wanted to get in depth, but I'm going to assume that you read some of the cases. I wanted to make sure that there were some examples of scopes of what the courts look at so that you feel comfortable with the decisions that you're about to make. But I do plan on skipping over some of those, okay? So, what is a moratorium? The best definition I like is actually from Cornell University. Simply put, it's an authorization to either postpone or suspend some activity for a period of time until the purpose for the moratorium is satisfied. I think the latter of that is important. The purpose of the moratorium is satisfied. As Andrew mentioned in the beginning, you need to develop a purpose. Are you trying to prevent something? Are you trying to fix something? I think you'll see from the theme of the court rulings that a legitimate governmental purpose is necessary when adopting something like this. However, pursuant to Chapter 166, you are allowed to adopt a moratorium. So legally, they are allowed, right? But let's just continue to focus on the legitimate government purpose of what you're trying to accomplish. So how are these attacked? It would be a Fifth Amendment or a takings clause. And I put them there for your reading. I'm not really going to read them verbatim. Or it's a 14th Amendment, which is a substantive due process. Now, I do think it's important to understand that Florida Constitution does change the definition of a taking a little bit. It says no private property shall be taken except for a public purpose and with full compensation instead of just compensation. There was a case law that made that change. So I did want to point out that discrepancy. And then when you're dealing with the taking, you're dealing with a regulatory taking or a direct taking. Right? Direct taking is eminent domain. It's Chapter 73 and Chapter 74, a whole different process. Not really relevant for a moratorium because, you know, an eminent domain is the government intending to take a property for a roadway or a bridge or some kind of infrastructure. However, a regulatory taking is twofold. It can be a facial taking, so the mere enactment of the ordinance is depriving a property owner of 100% of the economically viable use of it. Those are hard to prove because it's not as applied, which is the other type of regulatory taking. It's simply, the government adopted this legislation, and the moment it was adopted, I lost 100% of the use of my property. So you can understand how that's a little bit more difficult to prove. Most challenges are as-applied regulatory takings. And as applied, look at the Penn Central case, which is a pretty popular case, still good law. And the standard of proof is really whether there has been a substantial deprivation of economic use or reasonable investment-backed expectations. Right, so that's really the question the court is looking at when you're talking about an as-applied taking. And that would be under either the Fifth Amendment or potentially under substantive due process, which, unless you're dealing with a protected class, sex, age, religion, etc., substantive due process or 14th Amendment claims are analyzed under the rational basis test. Commissioner Morone, was this reminding you of law school a little bit?
Bit.
Yeah.
Property 1 and property 2.
Yeah. So the question really under rational basis is whether there's a rational relationship that exists between the ordinance and a conceivable legitimate governmental objective. Fancy word for a legitimate government purpose. Two-part test. They determine what the purpose was, and then they determine if the regulation was rationally related to the goal that the government was trying to accomplish. Now, this case, WCI Communities, kind of laid out the spectrum, right? Because second or third bullet, it lays out the real question on the one question that is really what the court is looking at. But then the last bullet kind of lays out the other end of the spectrum, which is an action that has no foundation in reason, is mere arbitrary or irrational exercise of power having no substantial relation to the public health and safety the court should set aside. All right, so you kind of have the spectrum here on this slide on what the courts are going to look at. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics of these cases. However, I do think it's important to understand why these cases matter, which is they have laid out the procedures on how these moratorium ordinances, right, not resolutions, are enacted. Okay? So the moratorium ordinance that we've discussed and this commission has discussed for the last couple of meetings would be related to zoning of some nature. And the reason that's important is because unlike a resolution which can have one reading, unlike even an ordinance amending your code of ordinances, which has 2 readings but only has to be advertised once, an ordinance like this has to be advertised similar to what you would do for rezoning a property or updating a future land use map, right? So that would actually require 2 public hearings. Both of them would be advertised. There's day requirements. One has to be 5 days from the notice, has to be 5 days ahead of time. The other one needs to be 10 days after the first meeting. So there's very specific parameters that the clerk's office would have to work through to ensure that due process is afforded. Because as I mentioned in these cases, they were both overturned for due process. One of them was an emergency amendment, and the court found it because you are dealing with property rights or preventing someone from applying for permits or doing certain things, it's important that you give them an opportunity to be heard and that you provide them due notice, right? Notice of what you're doing so that you can hear them out and give them a bite of the apple.
What are you seeing in the case law with regards to the length of moratoriums and what will be tolerated by the court and what won't be?
Perfect segue. So I kind of laid it out there. It was really all over the place. I will say I saw moratoriums as long as 7 years, but that was strictly for infrastructure. There was no sanitary sewer capacity, and even the one that the city had, I believe, was 4 or 5 years maybe. This one was for 9 months to try to go through a comprehensive. It depends on the legitimate government purpose and what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because infrastructure makes sense to most people, which is why I don't believe we got a challenge when we issued that one, because we had no capacity, right? There was nowhere to put the development. But if you're doing something like comprehensive planning, or the courts are clear, when you set out this purpose and you issue this moratorium, you are obligated to work through the process. This isn't a pause, let's have one meeting a year for the next 7 years. This is, we are rolling up our sleeves and we are getting to the bottom of the issue so that we can resolve this and move on.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Absolutely.
Do you have a rough idea on how long those trials took to play out before the moratorium was overturned?
So I haven't showed you any cases that they were overturned yet. So this was 9 months. It was upheld. Most of these were upheld except for the last one, which,
Oh, I thought they were overturned for
don't-
not following due process.
what was that?
I thought they were overturned for not following due process.
Oh, those. No, I don't have how long the litigation lasted. But I do have the cases, so I can get back to you on that. So, for example, Tahoe, another big case on taking 32-month moratorium to develop a preservation plan for Lake Tahoe was upheld. Next one, building moratorium for conducting and preparing a comprehensive study was upheld. All of these are just, I wanted to give you all some examples. 30-month moratorium upheld, 2-year moratorium upheld, but as you can see, I also included the purpose behind them. Right? There was a legitimate government purpose that they were trying to accomplish here when they issued these moratoriums. And I think that's important to keep in your mind when having this discussion. This case is the one no that I provided for you because I think it's pretty interesting, so I'm actually going to go through the fact pattern quickly. City initiated a charter amendment setting a max, or what the court considered a cap, on all dwelling units in the city. 40,000 dwelling units on density in the entire city. And it was city commission or city council initiated. The electorates of the city approved it via a referendum, and then the Planning and Zoning Board recommended to the City Council that they do a blanket 50% reduction on density in multifamily zoning districts. The key part here is city staff testified that the city was not going to reach this cap for many years. And the reason that's important is because due to that testimony, the court found that the cap did not bear a rational relationship to a permissible municipal objective because they were nowhere near that cap. So what was the purpose? Although it's important to realize that even though the electorates of the city approved this, it was still found to violate the 14th Amendment due to the fact that there was no relation. So I just wanted to mention that because it was pretty shocking to me when I read that. So next. Burt J. Harris Jr. Private Property Rights Protection Act, or Burt J. Harris Act, it goes by many names. Essentially, in 1995, Florida developed a cause of action for landowners to go after regulations that don't amount to a taking. Okay, so what we just discussed before was a taking. Regulatory, facially regulatory, as applied regulatory. So we're talking about the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution or the Florida Constitution. These are ordinances or regulations that don't amount to a taking, but still inordinately burden the use of the person's property or the investment-backed expectations. Okay, so what does that mean? The statute goes on, and I did include it in the packet as well. What does inordinately burden mean? Property owner is permanently unable to attain the reasonable investment-backed expectations for the existing use of the real property or a vested right to a specific use of the real property.
What does that mean, vested right to a specific use?
Permitted right.
So there's a comp plan that exists today, and there is a property owner that could build within the confines of the comp plan and is not fully built out into the comp plan. Is that considered a vested right that that property owner has?
I would look more towards the Land Development Code regulations as opposed to the comprehensive plan. But, for example, a vested right, if the height on this piece of property has been 50 feet for the last 10 years, and I buy it today, I'm buying it with the expectation that I can build up to 50 feet on this property, right? So it's not a blanket rule. It's not, you can't change these things, but these are arguments that they can make in court, and this is a heightened burden though, right? Unlike the rational basis test, which, as you can see from the cases, the court really defer to the local governments. They don't like to get involved much. This is a harder standard to prove, this inordinate burden, because it's the either or, and it's heightened. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
No problem. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I think it's relevant, but hopefully I'm not wasting people's time. So on the Burt Harris, the city does something that is, and we've gone through that where the residents sued the city, were successful. We had to write checks from the city and cover the legal cost associated with that. What happens if we get sued over the taking of the property? We'll have legal fees. Do we have run the risk of having to do a buyout on that side of it as well?
A buyout on what side?
Well, like if somebody sues us and they're successful because we did this incorrectly.
Yes, and I will get, attorney fees are part of this. But the thing about the Burt J. Harris Act is, first off, in 2021, they lowered the time requirement for a property owner to notify the city. So it used to be 180 days, and now it's 90 days. So if I could just get to one slide, Commissioner Pletcher, or sorry, Member Pletcher, I think it would answer. I kind of lay out the process. They have to serve you with a notice for 90 days, with 90 days notice. You have to come back at them with a written settlement offer. This written settlement offer lays out a bunch of lists that the local government can do, but the settlement doesn't necessarily need to be monetary. It can be, okay, we're willing to allow this use, right? So you can kind of get creative here with what your settlement offer is. If they deny it, then the court conducts a bench trial, determines whether there was an existing use or a vested right that existed, and whether the government actually inordinately burdened that. If they decide they do, then they impanel a jury, or the property owner can say, no judge, just go ahead and decide how much you award me in compensation, because you haven't taken my property, so I don't deserve full compensation, but I deserve some compensation because it's now been established that your regulation burdened my property. So attorney fees are always applicable here.
I'm thinking Chmielewski.
If such a settlement offer is rejected and they choose to pursue action, how long would such a trial typically take?
In the legal world, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, just to give you context, we have appeals for short-term rental ordinance, for short-term rental violations at code enforcement that have been going on since 2019.
So
for delay, I mean, trials, and so, I mean, these things can go on a while. However, the statute is laid out to try to have the local government and the property owner resolve their issues before court, which is why it requires the notice and the settlement offer, and hopefully a resolution before it gets to court.
is there potential that the plaintiff could petition for some type of emergency injunction to the moratorium to proceed?
An emergency injunction?
Or whatever the proper term would be.
An injunction on, I would say yes. However, that's a whole different set of laws when it comes to an injunction, like a temporary injunction of some sort.
If they say I've got plans for a building, I've spent the money, I'm going to suffer irreparable harm, and there's no adequate remedy at law, do I get an injunction from being stopped from going forward with my project?
I hate to say it this way, but if I was a judge, I'd tell you. But it's kind of hard to tell because it's so fact-specific and it's so case-by-case, and in no way am I trying to scare the commission. I'm really trying to help you understand that if you have a valid purpose that you are trying to accomplish, we can't prevent the city from getting sued, right? I mean, we go to code enforcement, we put on our case, we feel like we did a good job, and then we get appealed. So you can never fully prevent a case from happening, but at least you're resting your hat knowing that you did things the right way, and it's going to make your city attorney's job a little bit easier putting on an argument in court of law.
So if I may, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, and those who are watching or in the audience, to net out, the Burt Harris Act protects the property owner from an action taken by the governmental entity. For a private home, and I'll just use a simple example for easy understanding. People have a single-story, slab-on-grade home. They have the ability to build up. City says, no more two-story homes. Don't care, you can't build up anymore. That homeowner can come forward and say, hey, I just lost 30% of my value. can they make a claim under Bert Harris to say, you just took an action, I lost 30% of my value of my home?
And if I can amend that question, if it's all right.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it down to a basic
Because-
that everyone can relate to.
The Community Planning Act says you can review the comprehensive plan, make changes, based on relevant, appropriate data, studies, surveys, et cetera. Does that, if you're opening up, let's say, a moratorium with cause, because we have a problem we need to address, then you do the studies, and all the studies come back and say, hey, we need to not allow anything above 1 story anymore, for example. Does that give you, so it's not an arbitrary, capricious, or just random change, but rather because it shows that sea level is going to be X and we can no longer do 2-story homes. So if the change is made because of, updated studies, data, and so on, does that give you better standing as a city? Or?
Yeah, so the answer to your question on that is, as Matthew was saying, is that if you do your homework and you do this correctly and you identify the problem you're trying to solve or the thing that you're trying to prevent, and we write it up, and we've hired consultants, we've hired planners, we predict this, the planning consultants have said this is going to be a 10-month process. They go through the process. It comes out that, yes, you have to down plan a certain area. The better choice would be just to say that those folks are non-conforming. I mean, you may have to look at some non-conformities in that situation. It's hard to say, but the answer to your question is, if you do everything right, adopt it by ordinance, have due process, give everybody the right, the legitimate public purpose is there. I can't say you're not going to be sued. I can't promise you that. The Bert Harris Act provides a statutory cause of action, whereas the constitutional law ones are a lot harder, a lot more expensive. Usually a lot of attorneys will do it just on contingency because they're years in the making. That's why the Bert Harris Act came up in part, because it was a statutory way to basically deal with this situation. But I think the answer to your question is you probably will get an action. If someone says you've reduced my value by 30%, you might get, if that 30% equals $3 million, you may get an action against you. Or you may have to make decisions and say, well, we are going to down plan, or we're going to down zone. Remember, your plan and your zoning codes have to be consistent, but we may have to accept some legal nonconformities because certain people were vested. They were already in the pipeline. They have already changed their position towards building in this way, like 2 stories or whatever it is. Hopefully that makes some sense.
In one situation, we had a property owner that sued us because we didn't keep people off of his private beach, and it was considered taking, and we had to write a check for $2 million for one property owner because we didn't keep people from walking on his beach. And we wrote out a check for $2 million. And that's why I'm a little sensitive to this, because I want to make sure that those things don't happen again.
Yes.
Don't happen.
Yeah, so in that situation, that was as opposed to regulatory taking. Regulatory taking, there's a regulation that affects it. In that situation, it was said the city did all of these different things that caused my beach property to be devalued so much that it amounted to a taking. That's the case that we're talking about, and that's actually and it was an expensive case, I'm sure, to try on all sides, and at the end of the day, there are attorney fees provisions set out for that. That's why only certain attorneys take those cases, because they is sort of like a PI case, if you will. They have to carry it the whole way, but if they win, they pay out. But that was inverse condemnation rather than regular regulatory condemnation or taking.
Commissioner Grill, I can tell you the reason I was asking is when a investor is either finance-backed or venture capital-backed and they have a potential $450 million investment, then a delay of a few years has a miraculous way of bringing people to the table to agree on a compromise.
So, just touching on the Bird J. Harris, since this all tied into moratoriums as well, I did want to make one point that the last point on this slide. So, the state did not call it a moratorium, but it said, and this is under the Burr-Harris Act statute, a temporary impact on development, which you all understand the definition of moratorium can be there, that is in effect for longer than 1 year may, depending on the circumstances, constitute an inordinate burden. Right, so they throw that in at the end. So although the test is above, it makes it clear that a moratorium or an impact on development or a stay or a pause, if in effect longer than a year, may cause this, as opposed to the constitutional challenges where you're looking at a rational basis standard, more deference to the local government, you're having 32 months, 7 years, 2 years moratoriums that are not a taking. So I just wanted to make that discrepancy. Also, with Bird J. Harris, which is a big distinction. Unless the regulation is clear and unambiguous and you mail it to the property owner via certified mail, which would trigger a 1-year statute of limitations to bring, I wouldn't say statute of limitations, but it would trigger a 1-year time frame to bring a cause of action. Bird J. Harris, they have 1 year to bring it the moment that it's applied to them. Does that make sense? So let's say you adopt a land development code regulation and a property owner is not served, right? We don't send mail ordinances to property owners or anything, and decides to come in for a conditional use permit. And at that point, this ordinance that you adopted, you're using it to regulate something against them. They have a year from that point. Right, so I couldn't find any cases that say, okay, how long, what about this ordinance has been in play for 5 years? Like, there is a 4-year statute of limitations, so you still have to be within that window. But I do think it's a big distinction to realize it's not the moment that you adopt something, it's a year from when it's applied to the property owner. Okay. Since we discussed conditional use permits, Andrew and I thought it was important to at least touch on this statute, which is titled Governmental Exactions. It's also part of the packet. So what an exaction is any condition imposed by a governmental entity on a property owner's proposed use of real property, which could be seen as a conditional use permit or an application, that lacks an essential nexus to a legitimate public purpose. Lo and behold, the legitimate public purpose comes out again and is not roughly proportionate to the impacts of the proposed use, right? So different terminology, not rational basis, but something to keep in mind with these CUPs and these conditions that you impose. They have to be related to a legitimate public purpose, and they have to be roughly proportionate to the impacts of the proposed use. Roughly. Once again, I'd laid out, there's a pre-suit notice, 90 days. Yeah, I'm not going to get into the specifics because it's in the packet that I gave you, but that's the burden of proof is on the governmental entity to show that there was an essential nexus, and then proving damages is on the property owner because they have to show an appraisal before and after and how this actually affected them. One thing to keep in mind, Member Pletcher, since you mentioned attorney fees, this was interesting in the statute. The state actually waived sovereign immunity for these types of cause of action. So if you all are familiar with sovereign immunity, if someone slips on our sidewalk, it's $300,000 per accident, $200,000 per person. Under this cause of action, the state has waived those caps, right? So it can go over those in damages if the local government loses. And that is it.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a good lesson, a good overview, good history lesson, good current lesson, good look forward lesson, good what to look for lesson. Lots of lessons.
Terrific job, city staff. You guys,
Yeah.
it's excellent, excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
We almost made it on time, so.
We're close.
Mr. Mayor, I would suggest, on the package that we have from Amber, I counted about 10 questions. If you don't mind, just so we can, adjourn today, we can write up the answers to those questions, email them back to you, and the clerk can post those answers on the city website. That way, all those questions will be properly responded to. And that will give us a little bit of time to do, a proper response, because we just got this today, so. But we can probably get that out by Friday? No? If that's
Any
okay.
objections to that?
No?
All right, sounds good. Anything else? All right.
What are we going to do about a second, we're going to do a second workshop? Is that something we're going to discuss now, or discuss it at our regular meeting? I mean, 'cause I don't think it ends.
Yeah, I think we could have a conversation, or maybe a second workshop, to discuss how we could move forward if the commission so decides to move forward. Would that,
Yeah, when we're discussing moratorium, how do we do that when we're getting legal counsel? What is the procedure, and what is is this an open session, is it not?
You can't have a closed meeting on this. Like, so sunshine law, I mean, this is not litigation, so I
Okay.
can't have a closed meeting with you all on this. I don't know, Alex, I think a second workshop this has been a lot of information.
Yes,
Lots
I
of
agree.
information. I think it's been helpful to talk to both the LPA and the governing body together.
Absolutely.
There's not only because there's great knowledge and historical information there, but you've got the information from staff. Now, a follow-up workshop would be great to, what is it you want to do? What are the steps you want to take? That's what I'm looking for. If, in fact, you want to get to a moratorium, I want those kind of details.
yeah, and I agree with the attorney, and we can talk about, the consultant support and timetable and budget and all those things that we need to discuss in terms of making a plan on how to go forward.
And separate and apart from that, I mean, moratorium is just kind of one aspect of it.
Yeah.
But I think if we're going to talk about the comp plan as we open it up and look at it, are we going to get some bullet points as to what we're keying in on instead of a shotgun approach? Are we going to key in on height and density? Are we going to key on height and density and traffic? And do we need consultants for some of this? So I think we need to at least distill this big presentation down into, if we've said we all want to review it, okay, well, we're not going to just read it and look at it. We're going to look at something close enough to either say we need to take action or we don't need to take any action. So what are those things? And maybe we don't have it today, but maybe we talk about it at the next meeting, is let's get together comprehensively, both boards, and bullet point out, maybe very high level, those 4, 5, 6 things that we're hearing the residents are concerned about, and start to try at least try and get it focused in.
Yeah, and one of the things I picked up on, I'm sure everyone did, quote, "What problem are we trying to solve or prevent?"
Bingo.
There it is.
Who says that? Bingo.
Now,
I have one takeaway, it's that.
yes, so
Yeah, of course.
the other piece of that is going to help you then come to Commissioner Marron, suggestion of narrowing down things. At your 6 o'clock meeting, we do have a presentation on the effort that has been going on to date on the compliance with state law and county comp plan, which we have had a consultant engaged for several months now, and they have an update for you in terms of what's going to be submitted to the state. So we are doing a lot of the technical compliance of the comp plan. And having that information coming today, I know it's going to be piling more into what you already heard this afternoon, but then it will help you narrow down, okay, we already looked at this, and then you can come back and say, okay, now we should look at doom, right? You know, and that's going to help us then figure out exactly, you know, what kind of consultant do we need, you know, and what the budget for the consultants are going to be, but all that's going to get,
I think that sounds like an excellent process, and whatever the planning board can do to help facilitate that. But I think identifying the problems and realizing what tools we need to solve those problems, and getting everybody to roll up their sleeves. And so whatever we can do on the planning board side to help, I think we're pretty excited about that opportunity.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah, well, thank you, we appreciate that, and you coming out today, because doing it joint is really good.
Is there
They have to be here, yeah.
Is there a minimum amount of time before another workshop could be scheduled due to public announcement requirements?
72 hours.
Oh, okay.
So Friday?
Yeah, I'm just worried that our next planning board meeting is not for 3 weeks, and there's quite a bit to discuss, and we're, you know, there's a lot of pressing activity right now. Trade winds just filed today, so.
Well, we always have to be cognizant of the staff time as well, because they have other responsibilities outside of our directions. And so making sure that we give them enough time to prepare to have that meeting while taking on their other
Yeah.
roles and responsibilities.
My biggest concern about time, not only with this staff, is that the residents get that notice, because they're going to have more questions.
Yeah.
You know, we got to just, we have, these questions are going to get answered, and they probably will raise more questions. Plus, this forum probably raised a lot of questions. So that would be my only, I like to do stuff fast too, and I want to get it going and keep it moving, but I would like everybody to have the...
Yeah, I just don't want it to
Our
be
next
August.
commission meeting-
I agree. I agree.
another meeting.
Yeah, we don't need to be doing these quarterly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Yeah, we have a commission meeting in 2 weeks. We do it at, I mean, I don't know what everyone's calendar is, but maybe City Clerk, you can help us do your magic and coordinate it, and we do it at 3 o'clock again before the meeting. But,
Yep.
I think she's reminding us that there's dinner before the next meeting. We will eat it and enjoy it.
Thank you.
Pizza.
We're all hungry.
So, can we plan? Is that good?
So,
Let's do it.
meeting May 9th,
3 p.m.